And all of a sudden, you had the Tijuana Cartel with the Arellano Felix brothers. You had the Juarez Cartel under Amado Carrillo Fuente, the so-called Lord of the Skies. And then Chapo Guzman, Hector Güero Palma, and then also Ismael Mayo Zapata, Juan Esparragosa Moreno formed the Sinaloa Cartel that would eventually become the most powerful cartel in history. So now these cartels are not only engaged, for example, in Mexico with heroin, with cocaine, with marijuana, but they're also starting to focus on synthetic drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl. Fentanyl is probably the worst epidemic that we've seen here in the United States. Absolutely. Like you said, Vince, a lot of that is coming through the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border, and we're losing about 70,000 people a year just to fentanyl, and over 100,000 people to fentanyl and other drugs. Fentanyl it can be lethal to any human being with a dose of 2 milligrams, which is a few grains of salt. It's 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. So the precursor chemicals for fentanyl come from China, primarily China. Yeah. And the precursor chemicals come through the ports of Lázaro Cárdenas in the state of Michoacán, and then also Manzanillo in the state of Colima. Some of it comes in through the ports in Veracruz. And many people, Vince, and I cringe when they call these production labs for fentanyl super labs, because that denotes, Bunsen burners, beakers, pharmaceutical lab. You know what it is? It's a metal tub. It's a metal tub that they use, and they mix the precursor chemicals with shovels and sticks. Yep. And they cause pennies to the dollar in terms of, manufacturing it. It's easy to smuggle, simply because it doesn't have the volume of, let's say cocaine, marijuana, and other drugs. And the epicenter for smuggling fentanyl into the United States is the Tijuana San Diego corridor. The drugs are smuggled through the ports of entry. 90% of the drugs come in through the legitimate ports of entry. And in past years, the Customs Service only had the capability of searching about 17% of trucks coming across the border and about 3% of passenger vehicles. Now they're putting in more scanners, more high-density X-ray equipment, and by 2026, hopefully, they'll be able to search 75% of the trucks and maybe about 20% of the vehicles. Still not going to be perfect, because they have to keep commerce moving. And right now, Mexico is our largest trading partner. This past January, they supplanted China in terms of being our biggest trading partner in the world. So we have issues. I know that a lot of people say that the migrants are bringing the fentanyl across and what have you. That is an outrageous lie, simply because they have to move large volumes of it to satisfy the U.S. market. And a few backpackers are not going to satisfy the U.S. demand for fentanyl. Yep. And they use that, which I abhor, as, they use the migrants as political fodder. And let me make another interesting point here. is that it's Americans that usually transport, fentanyl and these drugs across the U.S.-Mexico border. Additionally, when you take a look at the border area, you have tunnels that have been created across that 2,000-mile border. So if you took a giant knife and cut across that border, it would look like a block of Swiss cheese with holes all over it. Secondly, border wall serves no purpose. It's nothing more than a monument to ignorance. You can go to Lowe's and buy a reciprocating saw for $100 and get a diamond grit blade, or a Diablo blade, as they call them, and you can cut through the bollards, or the slats, as I call them, within minutes. You have the tunnels, and then you have waterways along the Pacific, the common border with Mexico and U.S., and then also in the Gulf of Mexico. So these are all issues, but let me make it very clear that it's not the migrants that are smuggling the fentanyl across the border. It's all coming through legitimate ports of entry.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's there for illegal immigration. I think the walls serve its purpose. I think, not everyone has the means to cut through. Not everyone has the means to find a way around or over it. So it works in that sense. But for the drug trade, I think you're absolutely correct in the sense where it's a more orchestrated approach. It's not just onesie twosies carrying backpacks. It's a full facilitation of massive quantities coming into America, and by means of any means necessary, essentially. I think there's airplanes filled with the drugs. I think there's tunnels filled with drugs. I think there's vehicles filled with drugs. I think there's boats filled with drugs, and they're going to always find a way to circumvent our systems.
And then let me also say this, is that the Mexican cartels, Vince, are mixing fentanyl with other drugs.
Yes.
So a lot of the users, the consumers here in the United States, are unaware that they're consuming fentanyl, and that is what is leading to a lot of deaths as a result of fentanyl overdoses.
Yeah.
Let me also say this, is that the Mexican cartels have penetrated. They're not only doing or manufacturing or distributing drugs, but right now they penetrated the avocado industry, which is a $3.5 billion a year industry. Same thing with citrus fruit like lemons and limes, billion-dollar industry. They penetrated the fishing industry. Mexico has 7 oil or petroleum refineries, and they're tapping into these petroleum or Pemex pipelines and stealing about $1 billion worth of petroleum every year. Now, not everybody uses drugs, but everybody uses petroleum. And the other thing, too, that has become a multi-billion-dollar industry is the issue of migrant smuggling.
Yes.
Migrant smuggling, and they smuggle them across, the border, through the Rio Grande River. We've seen tragic incidents where they abandon them in, the tractor trailer rigs with no oxygen, with people dying there. So Correct. It is a very treacherous business, but it's gotten to the point where the cartels, in order to be able to move these migrants and know who's paid, who hasn't paid. You've been to some of these concerts where they give you a band, a little plastic band. Cartels are using that with the migrants to determine who's paid, who hasn't paid. So they're moving thousands of people across the border. And let me also say this, that the United States is also responsible for a lot of that migrant crises that we're seeing along the U.S.-Mexico border, because in the late 1980s, we started to deport a lot of the Mara Salvatrucha or the MS-13 gang members. You'll recall, Vince, out of California, and they send them back to the Northern Triangle, the countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And they proliferated inside and outside the prisons. Now they're engaged in murder for hire, extortion, drug trafficking, and that has caused a lot of people to flee the Northern Triangle countries. You know, you'll recall the United Fruit Company, where we propped up dictatorships,
Yep.
you know, in Latin America, especially in Central America, you know, but you know, also, you know, they're fleeing poverty, they're fleeing issues with, you know, natural disasters like hurricanes. So I look at it as a major problem, but at the same